record. So what you can see here, these little glass tubes, they are glass tubes. They're called vacuum tubes. The reason why they're called vacuum tubes is because they have the air has been evacuated out of them. So they're a vacuum. There's nothing in there except the metal that you can see. And, you know, there's reasons for that. Air contains oxygen, and oxygen reacts with metals. And this has a lot of metals. So if you have a very hot glowing wire in an oxygenated environment, eventually that wire will fail. Eventually that wire will break and fail. So if you're going to have a light bulb or anything like that, it'll last longer if you remove the oxygen. So there's two ways of removing the oxygen. One is you can just evacuate it. Another way is you could evacuate it and then replace it with nitrogen. And so nitrogen is a good replacement because it's about the same weight as oxygen, and but it doesn't react with metals. But I think in the old days they weren't really into nitrogen replacement because that would require you to separate gases, which is a little bit of work. So what they do is they just evacuate the gas, and so we had a vacuum tube. But that means that you've got something that's it's more stable because it doesn't have oxygen in it, but there's a difference in pressure between the inside and the outside, and so you could get a situation of an implosion. That is where the glass collapses. Especially if you're having rapid changes of heat, heating and cooling cycles, which happens when you turn on devices like this and turn them off. So the glass was really kind of pretty hard glass, right? I mean, pretty thick so that it wouldn't break. Anyways, those were vacuum tubes, and they cost a bit of money, and they relate to something that we have in our computers nowadays, which is a logic gate. So each of these vacuum tubes would be a single logic gate. And so if you can build up enough logic gates, you can have a computer circuit. And so the very first computers had logic gates which use these vacuum tubes, but they're expensive and they heat up. Now, all sort of electronic devices in those days, that's what they would use. So the old TVs, the first TVs from the 1940s, before they got the transistors, they would be using vacuum tubes as well. And so I remember watching TV in the 1960s, and you'd turn on the TV and you'd have to wait. And first there'd be a little light come on in the middle, and then it would spread and fill up the whole tube, and then you could wait. And it got really hot. And so what you were watching is a big cathode ray tube, but which was a big tube, and then you had these little tubes, right? But they work by the same sort of principle. They wouldn't really work unless they were up to temperature. So they'd have to get up to temperature, and they use a lot of heat. And it was less ideal than our modern situation by quite a long ways. This thing here is a replacement for those, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Does anybody know what this is if I point to it? Okay, so that's a computer chip. All right, it's a computer chip, and it has a lot of connectors on it. So those connectors come, each of those connectors goes to a little wire, which then goes to the little chip, which is inside in the middle. We'll talk about those a bit later, and we also need to talk about GUI. All right, so we're going to talk about a few more personalities. So we got this personality, this guy by the name of Alan Turing. You may have heard of the Turing Test. The Turing Test was named after Alan Turing as a sort of an honoring of him because he was a really smart guy in computing. And the Turing Test is basically, he came up with the thing. He'd say, well, a computer would be intelligent. We would say that a computer was intelligent if X and Y, if this happened and that happened. And I think what the X and Y were is if in a controlled sort of environment, it was able to beat a human at some kind of logical exercise. So that was the Turing test. Could a computer behave as intelligently as a human in a constrained exercise? That's a Turing test. And so every year they were having this competition where people would say that they built a computer program or a computer system, which included a computer and some programs, which they would enter to compete to see if the judges, who were computer scientists, would agree that their system passed the Turing test. And, a lot of failures. I think more recently that we are getting to the point where there may have been some, I'm sorry, I don't have the exact details on my mind, but you could check the Turing test, just do a Google on it, I guess. But I believe that there may have been some people who actually win that award. Okay, so what about Turing? Turing was his first work that he was doing was during the World War II, which World War II covered the period 1939 to 1945. He was in England, and so England was fighting with allies, the allies being the United States and the British Commonwealth and Russia, Soviet Union, and they were fighting against the Axis powers, the major one of which was Germany. And so the conflict was covered the European area, but it also covered the North Atlantic Ocean, because the Britain, being a small country, was not able to sort of get all the resources that it needed. Britain had a big empire, right? And it got a lot of its resources from around the world. And so it needed to have shipping to bring the food and manufactured goods, etc., to it during the war, and that was important to their war effort. Well, the Germans had a strategy, which was that what they're going to do is they're just going to sink all the ships that come from the United States and Canada to England, and that way we can force the British to sort of negotiate and maybe get out of the war. That would be a good idea, the Germans thought. And so the German Navy wasn't a big navy. They had a couple of big ships. You may have heard of the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. They were sort of sunk early in the war. So their weapon system that they used was U-boats, submarines, and they would sail into the ocean and sink the ships as they went by. Okay, so why is that important? Well, they had secret code that the people in Germany would send secret code instructions to the U-boats on where to look for these ships so you can go and sink them. And the same code would be used by the U-boat back to Germany saying, this is the stuff that we saw while we're out there, and these are the ships that we sunk. So it'd be really good if the British people would know what the Germans were saying to each other, right? As they're sort of sending those messages back and forth. And that's what Alan Turing did. He was able to, they got a example of the Enigma machine. It was called the Enigma code. They got an example of the Enigma machine. They got the messages. They're able to read the messages all the time. And they're all encoded, right? And they what is this message, right? They're able to see it, but they couldn't understand it. They did get to the point where they noticed, well, you know what? All of these messages, the last 10 characters are the same every time. Well, that's kind of weird. Okay, so what is it that the Germans are saying at the end of every message? Oh, I know, Heil Hitler. So we know how they end their message. They end it like that. So we can sort of use that as a basis to start doing some computations to figure out what the rest of the message is, cryptography. And so they built some machines according to his instructions, and he got the code for it, and they did a brute force sort of cracking of the code, and they were able to crack the Enigma code. Of course, they didn't tell the Germans that they cracked the code, because that would be bad, because then the Germans would come up with a different code, wouldn't they? So they had the code, and that meant they knew what the German submarines were doing. And therefore, they were able to go and sink a lot of the submarines, and that gave them a little bit of an edge. So he was a bit of a war hero. But I'll make the point. He had a bit of a chaotic life and a bit rough, I would say. I mean, if you look into his history, you'll see that he didn't live your sort of standard sort of family life. It was a bit chaotic, and some people didn't like it. And he actually didn't live to be as old as I am, right? And I don't know. I'm not going to tell you all the details about that. You can look into it if you want to. But that was Alan Turing. It's sort of a tragic life. The reason why I point that out is that human beings were also different, right? And kind of deep, right? There's a lot going on. People are really, really complex. Here you had this guy. He was like a genius, but he just couldn't keep his personal life. It's a bit of a mess. And yeah. Isn't that interesting? I don't know. It's interesting to me. All right, so after the war, World War II, there was a big development in computers. We have this ENIAC. So it's just one of those great, huge computers with lots of vacuum tubes that you saw taking up whole rooms. So those were being built for the government mostly. Of course, the war finished, but the conflicts never did, right? I mean, I don't know if you're aware of that, but at the end of World War II, straight away, almost, they're into another conflict because the Soviet Union had it wanted to expand into Europe. And of course, the Western allies, that's France, Britain, and the United States, didn't want the Soviet Union to expand into Europe. And so they had a bit of a standoff there. And that standoff led to sort of an arms race where they're building better weapons against each other and weapon systems. And computers featured a lot in that. Computers were a big part of the arms race. So they were building these computers partly for military purposes for the government, but also it was found that they're very useful in business purposes. The slide that you see before you is the last slide that I'll talk about in this lesson, so you can take a bit of a sigh of relief. This fellow here, so I'm just going to show his face and then we'll go back to him. So I talked a lot about the Germans. This fellow is a German. His name is von Neumann, John von Neumann. And von Neumann came up with this model. So when we talk about a model, we're talking about something abstract, which is something simple, which represents something more complex, so that we can use it to develop things or to understand things. And so he came up with this model. This is what we should do in a computer. We're going to have a fetch, decode, execute sort of thing going on. But basically, I hope there's some things that you recognize there. We've got an input and we got an output. Does that sound right? Input, output, and processing. So he came up with this model. This is what we're going to do with computing. This is how it should be. There should be some input, there should be some output, and there should be some processing. Also, associated with the processing, we could have different sub-units, I suppose you could say. We could have a control aspect, which would be a control unit would govern that. The control unit sort of gathers the resources that are needed for any particular code execution, and then controls when they happen. So the control unit says what steps using what stuff. So we're going to do this step with this bit of information. Then we're going to do this step with that bit of information. Okay, that would be handled by the control unit. The arithmetic logic unit, that actually did the computation, 10 by 10 would be calculated in the arithmetic logic unit. So that's why it's called the arithmetic logic unit. It's not just arithmetic unit, it's arithmetic and logic. And so the logic that they use was Boolean logic. Boolean logic is zeros and ones, trues and false, that type of thing, right? And so true and false, but also bigger than, smaller than, equal to. Those kind of things were all performed by the arithmetic logic unit. A memory unit was associated with the CPU unit. The memory unit is a place where we temporarily or longer store data that might be used in the middle of a program, right? So we're going to retrieve that data, etc. We'll talk about all of this a little bit more. I'm gonna finish on this slide, I think. Down at the bottom of that slide in the corner, you see one of the first programming languages. This is actually a programming language. Me looking at it, I think that's assembler. It references in the next couple of slides, it calls it something like this A0, and I believe the A stands for assembler. So assembler language, very low level language. You actually have to say in your computer program what address in the memory holds the information that you want and what you're going to do with it. So what we're saying here is take this number and put it in this memory address. Then at this memory address, we've got this value. And then we're going to add this value to that. So, I mean, it's pretty low level. You got very simple tools that you're using to program the computer. And so the programming work would be kind of long and hard. I think we're supposed to finish. So is that right? What time is that? We finish at 5, right? 4:50. So we got a couple more minutes. that's where I promised you would stop there. Just go, because we're talking about the German guys, right? I don't know. I really got to think about that, right? At the end of World War II, the Germany was quite desperate. It was always saw that it was going to lose this war, and so they're thinking, well, what are some possible things that we could have? So one thing that Germans had is they had some pretty good engineers, and so they came up with some new aircraft designs. So they had the first operational jet engine. First operational jet aircraft used in World War II was the ME's 262, two jet engines, one on each wing. So it was capable of doing much faster speeds. It could travel at like 600 miles an hour, where the propeller-driven aircraft had a maximum speed of like 400. So it was able to sort of attack its enemies in ways that, but you know, they're running out of money. They're running out of time. They're using plywood to build the fuselages. I mean, they're going to lose. But one of the things that they decided to do is, you know what, the British, they're doing all these things to us. You should, if you're interested sometime, look at the history of the war. It was pretty terrible. But you know, one of the things they're doing is the British every night would fly hundreds of airplanes across into Germany, and they just bomb the cities. I mean, you know, one night Hamburg, like I think it was like 25,000 people just died in a big firestorm. And it was a terrible, terrible thing. So the point I'm making there is, you know, terrible things happen on both sides of that war. But the Germans said, well, you know, this is not good. We're going to make them feel the pain that we feel. And so they built these rockets, and they put bombs on the rockets. And the rocket was called a V2 rocket. It went into very high in the atmosphere, almost into a suborbital. And then it would come down and crash into London and sort of blow up and kill some people. And, you know, to make the British people feel bad, I suppose. It probably just made them want to fight more. But anyways, the war ended, and the British and the Americans captured these rocket factories. And, you know, they got these rockets, and like, wow, what is this thing? You know, it goes up in the air and comes down from like way up in the atmosphere. Maybe this would be useful. And the person who was the chief of the V2 rocket program, who was making those rockets that were going over to England, his name is Wernher von Braun. Have you ever heard that name before? I don't know. Anyways, in 1969, when the first man stood on the moon, that was Neil Armstrong, he spoke on the phone to the President of the United States. President of the United States was Richard Nixon. The person who was standing beside Richard Nixon at that time was Wernher von Braun, who was the German leader of the rocket program. So what happened is, at the end of the war, he went over to America and he kept building rockets. And I guess the point that I make there is that why were they building rockets? Because they knew that the Russians were going to build rockets, right? And so the Americans are building rockets, the Russians build rockets. Russians got pretty good at it. They were the first ones to put a satellite into space, right? 1957. And they're the first ones to put a man into space. Yuri Gagarin. He was the first man in space, was a Russian. And so the Americans were afraid, well, you might say, well, why are they afraid of men being in space? Who cares, right? Well, who cares? Because that rocket doesn't always have to have a man on it. You could put a nuclear bomb on that rocket, right? And then that nuclear bomb could go around the world and land wherever you like. Well, that would be kind of bad for you if your enemy had that, right? And so that's what was going on. They were sort of, the Americans were afraid of the Russians. The Russians were afraid of the Americans because they're afraid that they're going to get this rocket that had a nuclear bomb on it. It's going to land on one of their cities. Just the last thing I'll say on that is the transistor radio. What's that got to do with the rockets? If you're going to have some kind of computer that's going to work with a rocket that goes to the moon, it would be good if that computer didn't weigh too much. You agree? Because if it weighed a lot, you're not going to get it off the ground. So they had to take a computer with them to land the lunar module on the moon. They had to have a little computer with them. And the United States government gave a lot of money to some computer companies so that they could make computers that were lighter. And so what did they discover? They discovered the transistor. So the transistor is a little thing like that replaced those big bulbs. And not only did they discover with a lot of money, the transistor, but they discovered a thing called integrated circuits. And so with an integrated circuit, that was that chip thing. And in the chip thing, you replace all those bulbs with just a little circuit that's printed on a wafer of silicon dioxide, hardly weighs anything. And then you could have a computer that was really small and really light, and you could put it in a computer, put it in a spacecraft. Well, this is way, way, way more powerful than that computer that they took to the moon. Way, way, way more powerful. I mean, this is more powerful than those big ones that was filling up the room. And that's because we've got integrated circuits. We're not using any bulbs or anything, right? And so but that happened, I believe, because of space program. I'm going to stop talking now because I talked a lot. All right, so if you want to go, I'm finished. I'm going to be here for a few minutes because I'm going to upload the video, but otherwise we're done. But if anybody wants to